Well, welcome to the weekly newsletter. So today is day 105 of the legislative session. And the big discussion at this point, as happens always at the end of a legislative session, is the budget. So the Senate last week put out some proposals on the table. A lot of you heard about it. I sent out our press release last week when we rolled out a budget. I want to talk to you a little bit about the thinking behind what we're proposing. So the first thing you saw was that we've proposed a $3,000 dividend this year. That follows our statute. So it's a statutory dividend. So that's written in law. The second thing we did is we proposed moving $12 billion from the earnings reserve account of the permanent fund into the corpus or main body of the permanent fund. The reason? To protect it. I'm going to talk about each of these with a little bit more explanation in just a minute. The last thing you're seeing us propose now is a percent of market value split. This would settle, going forward, what the permanent fund dividend would be in a statute. So those are complicated words. So let's take a look at what each one of those means. So first, let's talk about the permanent fund. You and I as Alaskans are very proud that we have a permanent fund. Back when we first sold our first leases on the North Slope, oil leases, it brought in about $900 million. Well, within a couple years, that was spent down. And Alaskans realized, whoa, we better protect this money because we're just going to burn through it. So let's create a permanent fund that can't be used unless a vote of the people. So in 1977, the permanent fund was established. And in statute, there are actually 3 goals for that permanent fund. So let's see what those are. First of all, it was to conserve the money. And that money was to be used for the benefit of all generations of Alaskans. Keep that in mind, benefiting all generations of Alaskans. Secondly, the permanent fund was to provide for the safety of the principal, that is the main fund itself, safety of that principal, and to maximize the earnings that would return from those investments. Lastly, the permanent fund was known as a savings device. We didn't want to burn through the money, right? So we're going to save it in a permanent fund. It was to be managed to allow the maximum use of disposable income. So, a few years later, 1982, we created the permanent fund dividend. That statute now, that law, is actually 39 years old. This is a very old law. The first money that went into the permanent fund was about $734,000. $734,000. Today the fund is worth a lot more, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. That would have been, in 2019 dollars, about $3 million. So you can see inflation, right? 734,000 at that time would have equaled 3 million in today. So let's talk a little bit more now about where the fund is at today. So we have 3 major funds that we're talking about drawing money from. So first off, we have the permanent fund up here. We just talked about the permanent fund. It's for the benefit of all generations of Alaskans. It's a savings account. It spins off earnings. It requires a vote of Alaskans to use any of that money. So there's a big lock on the permanent fund. See, it's in a lockbox, high up. Today it has about $65 billion, round numbers, $65 billion in it. Remember, it started out with 734 million, so it's really grown. Then we have a constitutional budget reserve. So this is a savings account. It has about $2.3 billion in it, and it requires 3/4 vote of the legislature. So that means 30 out of the 4 House members and 15 of the Senate members to access this money. So you could say there's a lockbox around it, but this cookie jar is on the very, very top shelf. This cookie jar is on a medium-sized shelf, right? But down very low is a cookie jar within the reach, very easily, of legislators. That's the earnings reserve account, the ERA of the permanent fund. So the permanent fund, $65 billion, is spinning off earnings. Today, that earnings reserve account has about $19 billion in it, $19 billion in it. And look how easy it is to get to. All it takes is 50% plus one of each of the legislative bodies. So that's 21 House members out of the 40 and 11 senators out of the 20. So right now, Constitutional Budget Reserve, over the past few years, we've spent $14 billion out of that account. Okay, more or less, probably a little bit more actually. We're down to only $2.3 billion. That's with a 3/4 vote. This cookie jar is on kind of a high shelf, but look, we've still managed to spend that out of it. The earnings reserve account, remember, is very easy to spend out of, and that's what we're concerned about. We want to preserve this. We don't want this money just frittered away. So that's why the Senate is proposing taking $12 billion of this and putting it up here in this lockbox. Putting $12 billion out of this up here. So if we put $12 billion, move that $12 billion into the permanent fund itself, in 20 years, this $12 billion will have earned another $64 billion. Do you see the magnitude of not only preserving $12 billion away from an easily spent fund, but we actually create a whole new permanent fund, like a second one, with that $12 billion. It's huge. And think about the magnitude of the earnings now of this even larger account. We'd be close to, we'd be over $80 billion in a lockbox that no one can get to without a vote of the Alaskan people. But let's go back down here to the earnings reserve account. So what does that mean for this, right? It's out of this that the dividend comes. So what we're suggesting with moving the $12 billion, yes, that would bring this count down to $7 billion. It's true. That's a lot of money. We would take out about $4.1 billion this year for the permanent fund dividend, PFD, and budget, right? But next year, it is projected that this fund will earn another $4 billion in 1 year. Coming out of here, it'll go in here, another $4 billion. So that by next year, this earnings reserve account will have moved up, will be about $7 billion. That's plenty of money to have here for a permanent fund dividend and any emergencies that we might have to meet. We're hearing about a very early spring. We're having very warm weather. There's a spruce bark beetle infestation that's even larger than we've had previously. That's a lot of dry timber sitting out there. We could have forest fires. This Constitutional Budget Reserve has served as our buffer for emergencies, and it also allows draws over the year to balance out paychecks for state employees, etc. But this $7 billion would be available to meet any emergency needs. So I wanted you to be aware of that. Now, last of all, we've talked about a percent of market value split. Taking this right here, we have a new law called the percent of market value. It allows us to take some of this money, obviously, limiting the amount of money for the dividend. So let's talk about that next. So the percent of market value. This is a law that we passed last year that defines how much money we can take out of that earnings reserve account. That account that's so easy to grab money from, the cookie jar that's on the bottom shelf, because we didn't want it to be robbed. Last year, or actually it was a couple years ago, the House of Representatives actually suggested that we fund the whole budget out of that cookie jar called the Earnings Reserve Account. The Senate doesn't want to do that. We wanted to protect it. So we finally passed last year the percent of market value, the POMV. It allows us to only withdraw 5.25% of the earnings out of the Earnings Reserve Account to spend on the dividend and then part of it for government. So, and actually in 2021, that's actually next year when we're working on the following budget, that'll drop to 5%. So the question before us right now is, how is the POMV, the percent of market value amount, this 5.25%, going to be split? Permanent fund dividend and government services. The proposal we have on the table right now is a 50-50 split. So half of this, 5.25, would go into the permanent fund dividend, and half would go into government services. So taking the amount of money this year, a 50-50 split of half of the 5.25 going to the dividend and half going to government services means that $2,343 would be your permanent fund dividend this year. Under this scenario, if we had a 50-50 split, the rest of the money would be available for government services. And with the budget we've proposed, that means we would have to take about $861 million out of savings to meet this year's budget. So think about this. First of all, a $2,300 dividend is pretty good, is pretty generous. And with a shortfall of $800 million still for our budget for government services, that forces us to keep reducing the size of government and preventing it from growing. If we don't have this kind of restriction on that earnings reserve account, there are folks that want to use that earnings reserve account to continue to grow government. It's easy money. That cookie jar is on the lowest shelf. So I hope this has helped explain some of the proposals, the three proposals that the Senate has put out. We understand that a major part of the population wants us to follow the statute in terms of the dividend this year, and that's a $3,000 dividend. It is unaffordable going forward. In fact, a $3,000 dividend means that we would be distributing to the people 75% of the earnings, the POMV, and it would leave us with about $1.3 billion shortfall in our budget. You can see that this just isn't sustainable. So what we're looking for is a way to do exactly what the permanent fund statute says. Conserve that money for the benefit of all Alaskans for generations to come, ensuring that it's a savings account, and ensuring that we get the maximum use of it, the maximum return for all citizens. So thanks very much for watching this newsletter. It's complicated, I know, but those are the things that we're struggling with this year in these last few weeks of the 121-day session. Thanks for watching.